In the winter of 1942, the world held its breath. In the high command centres of the Third Reich, maps of Europe were drenched in the crimson of German conquest. The mood was one of supreme confidence, a dangerous cocktail of victory and arrogance. Here, in rooms filled with men whose chests glittered with medals, the war was already won. The only question was how to manage the peace. And on one of these cold evenings, a group of German generals, architects of the most efficient war machine in history, gathered around a large oak table. They reviewed intelligence reports from across the Atlantic. The topic of discussion: America. One general, a seasoned veteran of the Blitzkrieg, pushed a file across the table with a dismissive flick of his wrist. "The Americans," he began, his voice dripping with condescension, "are attempting to build long-range bombers. They have a new factory, a project of the car maker, Henry Ford." Another general picked up the report, glanced at the projected numbers, and let out a short, sharp laugh. A laugh of disbelief. "A bomber an hour? It is absurd. It is American fantasy. They think building a 4-engine bomber is the same as assembling one of their tin can automobiles." The room filled with a low murmur of agreement and amusement. To these men, German engineering was an art form, a science of perfection. Their own aircraft, the Messerschmitts and Heinkels, were crafted by masters. The idea that unskilled American shopkeepers could mass-produce something as complex as a heavy bomber was not just wrong, it was insulting. It was a betrayal of the very principles of quality and precision they held sacred. They mocked the plan, they mocked the factory, and they mocked the nation that dared to dream it. They had no name for this place yet, this supposed factory of miracles. To them, it was just a symbol of American foolishness, a joke to be shared over brandy and cigars. But they should have paid closer attention. They should have listened to the whispers coming out of a muddy field in Michigan. Because in that field a monster was being born. It wasn't a factory they were building, it was a reckoning. A single, sprawling behemoth of steel and glass that would, by itself, become the weapon that would break the back of their empire. They laughed at the idea of one factory. They had no idea that one factory was about to answer their laughter with an avalanche of steel that would drown them all. The name of that place was Willow Run, and it would become the stuff of their nightmares. To understand the depth of Germany's arrogance, one must first understand the America of 1940. It was a nation haunted by ghosts. The ghost of the Great Depression lingered in the bread lines and on the faces of weary men. The ghost of World War I whispered warnings against foreign entanglements. The nation's industrial might, while vast, was sleeping. The great factories of the Rust Belt were humming with the sound of civilian life. Ford built sedans, Chrysler built family cars, General Motors built refrigerators. The rhythm of the assembly line was the rhythm of commerce, not conquest. The American military was a skeleton crew, its equipment outdated, its budget starved, its spirit isolationist. The German High Command saw all of this. Their spies and diplomats sent back reports that confirmed their every prejudice. America was soft, divided, and unwilling to fight. Its people were more concerned with baseball scores than battle plans. Its industrial power was a clumsy, gentle giant, incapable of turning its plowshares into swords with any speed or efficiency. Their analysis was not entirely wrong. It was simply incomplete. They saw the factories building cars, but they didn't see the minds behind them, minds that had perfected the art of mass production on a scale the world had never known. They saw a nation of consumers, but they didn't see a nation of builders, innovators, and problem solvers who, when pushed, could turn their collective will into an unstoppable force. Hitler himself famously scoffed at America's industrial potential. He believed its mixed-race society and democratic chaos made it inherently weak and inefficient compared to his disciplined, totalitarian state. He was convinced that even if America did enter the war, it would be years before its industry could become a real threat. By then, the swastika would be flying over London and Moscow. It was the ultimate miscalculation, a fatal act of hubris. He and his generals saw the body of the sleeping giant, but they failed to measure the size of its heart. And on December 7th, 1941, that heart was jolted awake by a thunderclap of betrayal and fury. The attack on Pearl Harbor did more than sink battleships. It shattered a nation's illusions. The debate was over. The comfort of isolation was gone, replaced by a cold, unifying anger. America was at war. But President Franklin D. Roosevelt knew that winning this war would take more than soldiers. It would take a miracle of production. In one of his famous fireside chats, he laid down a challenge, a promise that must have sounded like pure fantasy to the Axis powers listening in. He called for the nation to produce 60,000 airplanes in the next year, and 125,000 the year after that. To the German and Japanese high commands, these numbers were not just ambitious, they were insane. They were the ravings of a desperate politician, not the strategic goals of a serious military power. Germany, at the peak of its production, had never even come close to such figures. But Roosevelt wasn't talking to them. He was talking to the American people. He was talking to the machinists in Ohio, the steelworkers in Pennsylvania, and the car makers in Michigan. It wasn't a government decree. It was a call to action. A plea for a nation to unleash the very power its enemies had so arrogantly dismissed, and from all corners of the country the response was a deafening roar of yes. The revenge plot now had its goal. It was a number. A staggering, impossible number that would serve as the measure of America's resolve. To meet it, the nation would have to do more than just convert its factories. It would have to build new ones, on a scale and at a speed that defied imagination. And at the heart of this impossible dream was one man, an aging industrial titan who saw this challenge not as a burden, but as the ultimate opportunity to prove his life's philosophy. His name was Henry Ford, and he made a promise that was even crazier than Roosevelt's. He promised he would build a factory so vast, so efficient, that it could produce a 4-engine B-24 Liberator bomber. Every single hour. When Henry Ford announced his plan, even his own engineers thought he had lost his mind. A B-24 Liberator was one of the most complex machines of its time. It had more than 1.2 million parts, 30,000 of which were unique rivets. It was over 67 feet long with a wingspan of 110 feet. The established aircraft industry, companies like Consolidated Aircraft, built them by hand, piece by piece, in static stations. A good month meant producing a few dozen planes. Ford looked at this process and saw waste. He saw inefficiency. He saw a craftsman's approach to a problem that demanded a manufacturer's solution. The American way, he declared, is to build in quantity. We are going to build bombers the way we build cars. His vision was for a factory unlike any other. It would be a single, colossal building, a mile long and a quarter-mile wide. Raw materials would enter at one end, and fully completed, flight-ready B-24 bombers would roll out the other, one every 60 minutes. The government was skeptical. The aviation industry was openly hostile, mocking Ford's arrogant ignorance of aircraft manufacturing. They argued that a delicate, complex aircraft could not be built on a moving assembly line like a simple Model T. The tolerances were too fine, the systems too intricate, but Ford was stubborn. He was the high priest of the assembly line, and this was to be his cathedral. He secured a massive government contract and chose a site, a muddy 900-acre patch of farmland near a small town in Michigan called Ypsilanti. The local stream that ran through it gave the place its name, Willow Run. The plan for Willow Run was the blueprint for America's industrial revenge. It was a direct, audacious challenge to the German philosophy of quality over quantity. Ford was betting everything on the idea that an overwhelming flood of good enough could defeat a small number of perfect. Construction began in the spring of 1941. As the first steel beams rose from the Michigan mud, the project became a symbol of American ambition. It was either going to be the greatest industrial achievement in human history or the most spectacular and expensive failure. There was no middle ground. And in Berlin, they watched and they waited, confident that Ford's mad dream would collapse under its own weight. The construction of Willow Run was a war in itself. It was a battle against time, against the Michigan winter, and against the sheer, overwhelming scale of the project. Thousands of workers descended on the empty farmland, a chaotic army of builders, engineers, and laborers. They worked around the clock, under floodlights that turned the night into a strange, artificial day. The factory that rose from the mud was a monster. It was the largest enclosed room in the world. The main assembly building alone covered 65 acres. Its L-shaped assembly line stretched for more than a mile. It had its own power plant, its own fire department, and its own airfield with massive hangars and concrete runways. But building the factory was the easy part. The real challenge, the betrayal that nearly broke the entire project, came from within. The early days of Willow Run were a nightmare. Henry Ford, for all his genius in car manufacturing, had made a critical error. He had profoundly underestimated the difference between an automobile and an aircraft. A car was simple, forgiving. A bomber was a flying web of complex hydraulic, electrical, and fuel systems, all of which had to work perfectly, or 10 men would fall out of the sky. The established aircraft company, Consolidated, which had licensed the B-24 design to Ford, was uncooperative. They sent incomplete blueprints, often changing designs without informing the team at Willow Run. Ford's engineers, masters of automaking, were lost. They were used to stamping parts from steel. Now they had to learn how to form delicate aluminum skins. Worse still, there was a massive labor crisis. Willow Run was built in a rural area. Tens of thousands of workers were needed, but there was nowhere for them to live. People came from all over the country, especially from the rural south, lured by the promise of high wages. They ended up living in trailers, in tents, in overcrowded boarding houses. The conditions were miserable. Worker turnover was astronomical, sometimes as high as 100% per year. The factory became cynically known as Will It Run? By late 1942, a year after Pearl Harbor, the dream was turning into a disaster. The factory that was supposed to be producing a bomber an hour had managed to produce only a handful, and most of those were built by hand, not on the assembly line. They were riddled with defects. The press, once enamored with the project, turned on it, calling it Ford's folly. The government threatened to take over. The laughter in Berlin must have returned, louder than ever. The American shopkeepers had failed. Their arrogant attempt to apply their crude methods to the fine art of aircraft building had proven to be the joke the German generals always knew it was. It was the darkest moment. The promise seemed broken. The revenge plot had stalled. It looked as if the giant, for all its stirring, had simply tripped over its own feet. This was the moment the story could have ended in failure. But this is also where the true hidden strength of the American system kicked in. The system didn't give up. It adapted. It learned. It fixed its mistakes with a brutal, relentless efficiency. First, the government stepped in, not to punish, but to help. They financed the construction of a massive bomber housing project, creating a new city from scratch to give the workers decent living conditions. Second, a new man was put in charge of the operation. Charles Sorensen, Ford's grizzled, iron-willed production chief, a man they called Cast Iron Charlie. He had been with Ford since the beginning, the man who had helped turn the Model T assembly line into a global phenomenon. He was a ruthless, brilliant, and profane manufacturing genius. Sorensen arrived at the chaotic Willow Run and immediately began to impose order. He fired incompetent managers. He simplified complex processes. He broke down the impossibly complex task of building a B-24 into thousands of small, manageable steps. Each worker would be trained to do just one or two simple tasks, over and over, with mind-numbing repetition. One person might just drill holes. Another might just insert rivets. No one needed to know how to build a whole plane. They just needed to know how to do their tiny part perfectly. And crucially, he got the women of America on his side. With so many men fighting overseas, Sorensen and Ford launched a massive recruitment campaign aimed at women. They came in droves. Housewives, teachers, beauticians, farm girls. They had never held a rivet gun before, but they learned. They proved to be more patient, more precise, and more reliable than many of the men they replaced. They became the heart and soul of the assembly line. The Rosies of Willow Run, slowly, painfully, the great machine began to move. The assembly line, which had been static for so long, began to crawl forward. The first few bombers that came off it were still flawed, but they were better. The pace picked up. 1 plane a day, then 2, then 5. By the spring of 1943, the trickle was becoming a stream. The factory was finding its rhythm, the endless repetition, the sheer scale, the division of labor. Ford's mad dream was finally starting to work. The laughter in Berlin grew quiet again. A new sound was replacing it. the steady, terrifying, unending roar of thousands of Pratt & Whitney engines coming to life on a Michigan airfield. By 1944, Willow Run had become a monster of production, a spectacle of industrial might that beggared belief. It had become everything Henry Ford had promised, and more. The numbers were no longer a fantasy. They were a weapon. At its peak, Willow Run was completing a brand new B-24 Liberator bomber every 59 minutes. Let that sink in. A 4-engine heavy bomber with over 1 million parts, being born from raw materials in less time than it takes to watch a movie. The factory operated 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The assembly line, that mile-long metal serpent, never stopped moving. Workers operated in 3 shifts. When one shift ended, another took its place, picking up the tools without breaking the rhythm. The scale was biblical. Every day, the factory consumed a mountain of resources. 1.5 million pounds of aluminum, 50,000 pounds of rubber, miles of electrical wiring. Every day, a fleet of B-24s, sometimes as many as 25, would roll out of the massive hangar doors, line up on the airfield and take off, one after another, heading for Europe. A German intelligence officer, analysing reconnaissance photos and production reports in 1944, wrote a memo to his superiors that was filled with a sense of dawning horror. "We have made a catastrophic error in judgment," he wrote. "We focused on the quality of our individual weapons. The Americans have focused on the quality of their system. We have been fighting their soldiers, but we should have been fighting their factories. We cannot shoot down factories. And there is one factory, this Willow Run, that is, by itself, producing more 4-engine bombers per month than all of our German aircraft factories combined." The betrayal of their own arrogance was now complete. The joke had become a nightmare. The nation of shopkeepers had built a single factory that had a greater output than the entire industrial heartland of the Third Reich. The German generals, who had laughed just a few years earlier, were now faced with an unsolvable mathematical problem. They could shoot down 10 American bombers, even 20. But the next day, Willow Run would have already replaced them. Their own losses were irreplaceable. Their ace pilots, their skilled crews, when they were gone forever. The Americans, on the other hand, had a seemingly infinite supply of both machines and men. They were not fighting an army. They were fighting an industrial tidal wave. And Willow Run was the epicenter of the storm. The flood of liberators from Willow Run and other factories that followed its model fundamentally changed the nature of the air war. It was no longer a contest between fighter pilots, a duel of aces. It became a brutal, grinding war of attrition, and it was a war Germany could not win. Before Willow Run, American daylight bombing raids over Germany were costly, almost suicidal. B-17s and B-24s had to fly deep into enemy territory, where they were swarmed by the deadly fighters of the Luftwaffe. The losses were horrific. On some missions, 10, 20, even 30% of the bombers would not return. Crews had a terrifyingly low chance of surviving their 25-mission tour, but the sheer, unending number of planes produced by Willow Run allowed the American commanders to do something the Germans found incomprehensible, almost insane. They absorbed the losses and just kept coming. They could send 1,000 bombers on a single raid. 1,000. It was a number that broke the German defensive system. There were not enough German fighters, not enough anti-aircraft guns, not enough ammunition in the entire Reich to stop 1,000 bombers. The sky over German cities literally turned to steel. American bombers flew in massive formations called combat boxes, bristling with 50-caliber machine guns. They created a fortress of overlapping fire that was terrifying for Luftwaffe pilots to attack. A German fighter pilot, a veteran ace who had dominated the skies in 1941, described the change in a letter home in 1944. "It is no longer combat," he wrote, his words heavy with despair. "It is not flying. It is like trying to swim up a waterfall of metal. You dive on a formation and the sky erupts. Tracers come at you from every direction. It is not one gunner you are fighting, but 100. You might get one. You might see a bomber trail smoke. But as you pull away, you look back, and the hole in their formation has already closed. And there are 100 more behind them. And 100 more behind them. We are not shooting down planes. We are shooting at a cloud that never ends." This was the revenge of the assembly line, delivered at 25,000 feet. Every B-24 that rolled out of Willow Run was another nail in the coffin of the Luftwaffe. The factory that German generals had laughed at was now systematically destroying their air force, not just by bombing their airfields and factories, but by overwhelming their pilots with a target so vast, so endless, that courage and skill became irrelevant. The ultimate targets of this unending aerial armada were the very things that had given Germany its early advantage, its own factories. The synthetic oil refineries, the ball-bearing plants, the tank factories, the aircraft assembly lines. The industrial heart of the Third Reich, the raids were relentless. Day after day, the sirens would wail across German cities. The sky would fill with the drone of thousands of engines, and then the bombs would fall. The destruction was methodical, scientific, and terrifyingly effective. The oil refineries at Ploesti in Romania, vital to fueling Germany's war machine, were hit again and again until production slowed to a trickle. The ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt, essential for every moving part in a tank or plane, were pulverized. Albert Speer, Hitler's armaments minister, worked miracles to keep German industry going. He dispersed factories, built them underground, and cannibalized damaged machines to create new ones. For a time, German production actually increased under the bombing, but it was a losing battle. He was trying to patch 1,000 leaks in a dam that was being hit by a tidal wave. The problem wasn't just the damage to the factories themselves. It was the complete collapse of the transportation system that fed them. The bombers from Willow Run and the thousands of other Allied planes they flew with didn't just hit the big factories. They hit the small things: a railway yard, a bridge, a canal lock. They systematically choked the arteries of the German war economy. A tank factory might be untouched, but it was useless if it couldn't get steel from the foundry, or if the finished tanks couldn't be shipped to the front. By late 1944, the German war machine was starving and suffocating. The Luftwaffe's most advanced jet fighters, the Me-262, sat on airfields, unable to fly for lack of fuel. Elite panzer divisions were immobilized, their tanks abandoned on the side of the road, not by enemy fire, but by empty gas tanks. In his memoirs after the war, Albert Speer pinpointed the moment he knew the war was lost. It wasn't a battle, it was a production chart. A chart that showed the catastrophic drop in aviation fuel production after a series of massive Allied raids in the spring of 1944. The war was over, he wrote. From that point on, our defeat was a mathematical certainty. The American shopkeepers, with their single-minded, brutal focus on production, had achieved what our generals thought was impossible. They had won the war not with tactics, but with logistics. They had won it on the assembly line. In 1945, as the war in Europe drew to a close, a ceremony was held at Willow Run. The last B-24 Liberator, number 8685, rolled off the assembly line. The great machine, having served its purpose, was about to fall silent. The factory had employed over 42,000 workers at its peak, nearly a third of them women. They had come from every corner of the nation. They had endured hardship, racism, and grueling work. But they had done it. They had met the impossible challenge. In just 3 years, a single factory, born of a madman's dream in a muddy field, had produced more bombers than the entire empire of Japan had during the whole war. It had produced nearly as many as all of Germany. One factory. When the war ended, the government had no more need for bombers. The massive contracts were cancelled. The workers were laid off. The lights in the giant assembly hall were turned off. The mile-long line ground to a halt. The roar of engines was replaced by an eerie silence. For a time the monster sat empty, a ghost of its former glory. It was eventually sold to the Kaiser Frazer Car Company and later to General Motors, returning to the world of civilian production that had given it birth. But its legacy was more than just a building. Willow Run was a symbol. It was a monument to a moment in time when a nation, betrayed and underestimated, unleashed its full, terrifying power. It proved that a free, democratic, and sometimes chaotic society could, when united by a common purpose, achieve feats of production and will that no totalitarian regime could ever hope to match. The German generals had laughed at the idea of a factory that could build a bomber an hour. Their laughter had been answered by a storm of steel that swept their world away. The revenge was complete. It was a victory not just of arms, but of ideas. The idea that the collective power of ordinary people, the shopkeepers, the farmers, the housewives, all working together, could be the most powerful weapon of all. The echo of the hammers from Willow Run would reverberate through history, a timeless reminder of what happens when you awaken a sleeping giant, and a warning to all those who would dare to laugh at it. To truly understand the miracle of Willow Run, you cannot just look at the machines. You must look at the hands that built them. And overwhelmingly, they were the hands of women. They were called Rosies, a name born from the famous Rosie the Riveter poster. But they were not cartoons. They were real people. They were mothers, wives, and daughters who had been told their entire lives that their place was in the home. The war changed that. Necessity changed that. Imagine being a young woman from a small town in Kentucky, having never been far from home, never operated anything more complex than a sewing machine, and then, one day, you find yourself on the floor of the largest factory on Earth, handed a rivet gun that shakes your entire body, and told to help build a machine that will fly across an ocean to fight in a war. The work was grueling, deafening, and dangerous. The noise was a constant, skull-shaking roar of machinery. The air was thick with the smell of oil and hot metal. Accidents were common, but they kept coming. For many, it was the first time they had ever earned their own paycheck, the first time they had felt a sense of purpose, outside the domestic sphere. They formed bowling leagues, attended dances, and created a vibrant community in the shadow of the giant factory. They were building more than bombers. They were building a new future for themselves. But they also faced a deep, stinging betrayal every day. They were often paid less than the men for doing the same job. They were subjected to harassment and condescension from male supervisors who believed women were incapable of mechanical work. They had to fight for basic dignities, like clean restrooms and proper safety equipment. One Rosie from Willow Run, in a letter, wrote about the duality of her experience. "Some days, my arms ache so much I can barely lift them. The men look at us like we're a curiosity, like we're playing dress-up. But then, at the end of the shift, I walk outside and I see them. A line of new liberators on the tarmac, their silver skins gleaming in the setting sun. And I know I helped build that. My hands. I put rivets in that wing. And I know that plane is going to help bring my Johnny home. And in that moment, all the aches, all the insults, they just melt away. These women were the secret weapon within the secret weapon. The German High Command, in its rigid, patriarchal worldview, could never have conceived of mobilizing its female population on this scale. It was a source of industrial power they had completely overlooked. The revenge of Willow Run wasn't just Henry Ford's. It was the revenge of millions of women who were told they were not strong enough, not smart enough, not capable enough. They answered that dismissal not with words, but with a storm of 8,685 four-engine heavy bombers. They proved that the hands that had once rocked the cradle could also build the thunder that would rule the world. What was it like to fly in one of these machines, a product of this incredible assembly line? For the young men of the 8th Air Force, a B-24 from Willow Run was both a savior and a potential tomb. It was not a graceful plane. Pilots called it the flying boxcar. It was heavy, difficult to fly in formation, and less forgiving than its more famous cousin, the B-17. But it was fast, had a long range, and could carry a massive bomb load. And it was tough. Stories of Willow Run liberators returning to base riddled with hundreds of bullet holes, with entire sections of their tail shot away, with engines on fire, became legendary. They were built with the rugged, over-engineered spirit of a Ford automobile. They were built to take a beating. Imagine being a 20-year-old bull turret gunner. Your world is a tiny, freezing plexiglass bubble hanging from the belly of the plane. You are suspended over enemy territory, the most exposed member of the crew. Your only companions are the twin 50-caliber machine guns in your hands and the unending roar of the engines. An interview with a veteran gunner captured the feeling. You're just a kid. A few months ago, you were delivering groceries. Now you're at 25,000 feet, and the temperature is 40 below zero. Your oxygen mask is frozen to your face, and then you see them. Little black specks in the distance, growing larger. Focke-Wulfs, Messerschmitts. They come at you out of the sun, their cannons blinking like angry stars. You start firing. Your whole world becomes the vibration of the guns. You see your tracers reach out and hit one of them. You see a puff of smoke. But there are always more. They come in so close you can see the pilot's face. You see their cannons tear into the wing of the plane next to you. You see it shudder, fall out of formation and begin its long, lonely spiral down. You pray for the crew, but you can't stop. You just have to keep firing. You have to keep fighting until they're gone, or you are. But there was a strange, grim comfort in their numbers. Flying in a combat box of 1,000 bombers, you were not alone. You were part of a colossal, terrifying whole. You were one small part of the steel storm. The sheer size of the formation was a source of courage. The Germans could not get all of you. The law of averages was, for once, on your side. This was the human reality of Willow Run's production. Each of those 8,685 planes carried 10 young men into the heart of the fire. The factory didn't just produce machines, it produced the vessels that carried a generation's hopes and fears. The revenge against Germany was paid for not just with steel and aluminum, but with the courage and the terror of these young men, riding a storm they had not created, but were forced to navigate. The genius of Willow Run wasn't just its ability to build planes, it was the system that got those planes into the fight. Building a bomber in Michigan was useless if it couldn't get to a runway in England. This required the creation of another miracle, the Atlantic Air Bridge. Once a B-24 rolled off the assembly line, it was just the beginning of its journey. Test pilots would take it up for its maiden flight. Once certified, it was turned over to ferry pilots. And here again, women played a vital, unsung role. The Women Air Force Service Pilots, or WAS, were a group of pioneering female aviators who took on the dangerous job of flying brand new planes from the factories to the coastal airfields from which they would depart for Europe. They flew the same powerful, temperamental machines as the men, but they were considered civilians, with no military rank, no benefits, and no honours if they were brought down. From the coastal bases, a new crew would take over. They would fly the treacherous North Atlantic route, a series of hops from Newfoundland to Greenland to Iceland and finally to Scotland. They flew in primitive conditions, often with no radio navigation, flying by sight and by dead reckoning through some of the worst weather on the planet. This was logistics on a heroic scale, an unending conveyor belt of steel flying across an ocean. Meanwhile, in England, a parallel army was at work. The ground crews. For every bomber in the air, there were dozens of men on the ground keeping it flying. Mechanics, armourers, electricians, fuelers. They worked in the cold, wet English weather, often in muddy, makeshift conditions. When a bomber returned from a mission, it was often a wreck. Its skin would be peppered with shrapnel holes, its engines would be sputtering, its hydraulic lines would be leaking. The ground crew would descend on it like surgeons on a patient. They worked through the night, patching holes, swapping engines, reloading ammunition, refueling. Their goal was simple, to have that same plane ready to fly another mission at dawn. A German general, after the war, remarked that he was less impressed by America's ability to build planes than by its ability to fix them. "We would shoot one of your bombers full of holes," he said. "We would see it smoking, losing altitude. We would mark it as a kill. And the next day, we would see what looked like the very same plane, with the same name painted on its nose, back in the formation. It was demoralizing. It felt like we were fighting ghosts." This was the true depth of the system that the Germans had underestimated. It wasn't just one factory. It was a web of production, of transportation, of maintenance, and of human will that stretched from a workshop in Michigan to a runway in England. Willow Run was the heart, but the veins and arteries of this system reached across the world. And it was this entire living organism that was enacting its slow, grinding revenge on the Third Reich. The revenge of Willow Run wasn't only delivered by the high-flying heavy bombers. As the war progressed, the Allies achieved near-total air supremacy, a dominance made possible by the sheer number of aircraft America was producing. This allowed another kind of terror to be unleashed on the German army. The fighter bomber, the P-47 Thunderbolt, the P-51 Mustang, these were also products of the same industrial philosophy. They were mass-produced, rugged and armed to the teeth. And with the Luftwaffe largely swept from the skies, these fighters were free to go hunting on the ground. For the average German soldier, the Lanzer, the B-24 was a distant, abstract threat. But the fighter bomber, the Jabo as they called it, was a personal demon. It was a visceral, immediate, and terrifyingly intimate form of destruction. They developed a term for the paralyzing fear it induced: Jabo Schreck, or fighter bomber fright. Imagine you are a German soldier in a column of trucks, moving through a French forest. The sun is shining. For a moment it feels peaceful, and then you hear it, a faint, high-pitched whine in the distance. It grows louder, closer. It's a sound that makes the blood run cold. Everyone freezes. Heads turn to the sky, and then you see them. A flight of thunderbolts coming in low and fast, their wings glinting in the sun. There is nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The world dissolves into a chaos of noise and terror, the scream of the diving planes, the thunderous roar of their engines, and then the horrifying, ripping sound of their 8 50-caliber machine guns opening up. It doesn't sound like a gun. It sounds like a giant tearing a canvas sheet the size of the sky. The ground around you erupts in puffs of dirt. Trucks explode into fireballs. Men you were talking to just seconds ago simply cease to exist, vaporized in a hail of lead. You dive into a ditch, press your face into the mud, and pray. You don't pray for victory. You don't pray for the fatherland. You pray for the sound to stop. This was the daily reality for the German army in 1944. They could not move in daylight. Every road, every bridge, every railway line was a killing zone. A German general wrote in his diary, "My men are no longer afraid of the enemy in front of them. They are terrified of the sky above them. We are an army of moles, forced to live and move underground, only daring to come out at night." The industrial might of America, born in factories like Willow Run, had done more than just destroy Germany's ability to make war. It had destroyed their will. It had broken them psychologically. The nation of shopkeepers had learned to kill with a terrible impersonal efficiency, delivering death from an assembly line that stretched from Michigan to the front lines. The revenge was now being felt not just by the generals in their bunkers, but by every single soldier who dared to look at the sky and see it filled with American steel. In the bitter winter of 1944, Hitler, cornered and delusional, decided to make one final monumental gamble. He believed that the American soldiers were soft, that their lines were stretched thin, and that a single powerful blow could shatter their morale and force a negotiated peace. He gathered the last of his elite panzer divisions, including the fearsome King Tiger tanks, and the last of his precious fuel reserves. He planned to smash through the American lines in the Ardennes forest, split the Allied armies in two, and race to the port of Antwerp. It was the plan for what the world would call the Battle of the Bulge. It was the last roar of a dying beast. For a few days, the gamble seemed to pay off. The attack achieved complete surprise. American units were overwhelmed. The weather was atrocious, with thick fog and low clouds that grounded the Allies' most powerful weapon, their air force. The German tanks, shrouded in the winter gloom, pushed deep into the American lines. This was the moment of ultimate crisis. But it was also the moment that proved the totality of the American system's victory. Even as the frontline troops fought desperate, heroic battles, the giant of American logistics began to move. General Patton famously turned his entire Third Army 90 degrees and sent it racing north to counter the attack. It was a move that would have been impossible for the resource-starved German army. It required fuel, ammunition, and supplies on a massive scale, and America had them in abundance. But the real turning point came when the weather broke. As the clouds parted, the sky filled with the avenging angels of the Allied air forces. The Jabos returned with a vengeance. For the German panzer divisions, stuck on narrow, icy roads, it was a massacre. They were exposed, and they had nowhere to go. Their biggest problem was no longer the American tanks in front of them, but their own fuel gauges. They were running on fumes. The sight was surreal. The most powerful and feared tanks in the world, the mighty King Tigers, were being abandoned by their crews, not because they were destroyed, but because they had simply run out of gas. They sat on the side of the road, silent, frozen monuments to a failed strategy. Meanwhile, American fighter bombers, refueled and rearmed by an unending supply chain, circled overhead like vultures, picking them off one by one. The Battle of the Bulge was Hitler's last great betrayal of his own army. He had sent them into a fight believing that superior will and tactical brilliance could triumph. He was wrong. The battle was won by the side that could keep its machines fueled. It was won by the Red Ball Express. It was won by the oil refineries of Texas. And it was won by the factories in Detroit. An American GI, writing home after the battle, put it simply: we were outnumbered and surprised, but we just had more stuff. They'd knock out one of our tanks, and we'd have 2 more to take its place. Their tanks would run out of gas, and they were just done. It felt like we couldn't lose, because there was always more of us, and more of everything we needed, right behind us. In the smouldering ruins of the Third Reich, the architects of the German war machine finally had to face the truth. In their interrogation cells, stripped of their medals and their arrogance, they offered their final confession. It wasn't a confession of war crimes, but of a profound, philosophical failure. General Alfred Jodl, chief of the operations staff of the Armed Forces High Command, was asked what he had underestimated most about the Americans. He answered without hesitation: their ability to translate a blueprint into a reality. We would see their production plans and laugh. We thought they were propaganda. We could not conceive of them being true. We were wrong. But the most damning testimony came from the man who had been at the heart of it all, Albert Speer. He was a man who understood industry, a man who had performed his own miracles to keep the German war machine running, and he knew better than anyone exactly how and why they had lost. You see, he explained to his interrogators, his voice a monotone of intellectual defeat, Germany's fatal error was the belief that our advanced, high-quality, handcrafted weapons could win a war against a primitive mass-production system. We were like a master gunsmith with a single, perfect rifle, facing a man with a machine gun. The machine gun may be less accurate, less elegant, but it fires 1,000 bullets. The contest is over before it begins. We prided ourselves on quality. You delivered quantity, and your quantity had a quality all of its own. It was the quality of reliability, the quality of replaceability, the quality of overwhelming presence. He paused, a look of grim irony on his face. The generals who laughed at your factories in 1940, by 1944, they were the ones sending me desperate memos, begging for a single truck, a few barrels of fuel, a spare engine. They were defeated not by the American soldier, but by the American factory worker. They were defeated by the sheer, vulgar, unstoppable abundance of your system. This was the final, exquisite turn of the knife, the ultimate revenge. It wasn't just that America had won. It was that the enemy, in the end, was forced to admit that the very things they had mocked, the assembly line, the consumer culture, the shopkeeper mentality, were the very things that had destroyed them. Their entire worldview, their belief in their own superiority, had been proven not just wrong, but fatally, catastrophically, and historically wrong. The laughter had turned to ash in their mouths. The end of the war in Europe was not marked by a single dramatic battle. It was a slow, grinding collapse. It was the sight of proud German divisions surrendering not to an enemy army, but to starvation and lack of fuel. It was the surreal image of American GIs trading cigarettes and chocolate bars, luxuries from an economy of impossible abundance, to their defeated enemies in exchange for iron crosses and dress daggers, relics of a fallen empire. The war had become a tale of 2 philosophies, 2 industrial religions. Germany's religion was one of perfection. It was the religion of the master craftsman, the belief that a few exquisitely made, technologically superior weapons, wielded by elite soldiers, would always triumph. Their Tiger tank was the high altar of this religion. It was a masterpiece of engineering, a thing of terrible beauty and power, but it was also complex, difficult to maintain, and impossible to mass-produce. It was a weapon for a short, decisive war. America's religion was one of practicality. It was the religion of the assembly line, the belief that overwhelming numbers of good enough, reliable, and easily repaired machines would win a long, grinding war of attrition. The Sherman tank was its humble prayer book. The B-24 Liberator was its thundering hymn, and Willow Run was its cathedral. It was a philosophy that embraced imperfection, valued resilience, and understood that in a total war, the battle is won not by the side with the best weapon, but by the side that can keep its weapons in the fight. After the war, Allied engineers and inspectors swarmed over the remnants of German industry. They were in awe of the technical brilliance they found. They discovered designs for jet aircraft, guided missiles, and super-heavy tanks that were decades ahead of their time. They were brilliant. They were revolutionary. And most of them had never left the drawing board or had been produced in such laughably small numbers that they had no impact on the war. One American engineer holding the intricate blueprint for a revolutionary German jet engine reportedly shook his head in a mixture of admiration and pity. "They were trying to win the war with science fiction," he said. "We won it with a Sears Roebuck catalogue." It was a crude but perfect summary. Germany had bet on genius. America had bet on its system, and the system had won. The revenge wasn't just military, it was philosophical. The nation of shopkeepers had proven that their way, the messy, practical, democratic, consumer-driven way, was in the end the stronger way. What became of the monster, the great factory at Willow Run? When the last bomber rolled off the line, the lights went out. The government, its purpose served, sold the massive facility. For a while it was used to produce cars, a brief and unsuccessful venture by the Kaiser Frazer Corporation. Then it was bought by General Motors, and for decades it served as a transmission and assembly plant. The Cathedral of War became, once again, a simple church of commerce. The Rosies went home. Many were pushed out of their factory jobs to make way for the returning soldiers. They were told their service was no longer needed, that their place was back in the kitchen. For many, this was a final, quiet betrayal. But they took with them a newfound sense of their own power, a confidence that would fuel the women's rights movements of the decades to come. The seeds of another revolution had been planted on that factory floor. Over the years, the memory of what happened at Willow Run began to fade. The building itself fell into disrepair. In 2010, General Motors went bankrupt, and the plant was closed for good. The monster finally died. Most of it was demolished, torn down to make way for new development, but a small part of it was saved. A dedicated group of historians and volunteers, many of them descendants of the original workers, fought to preserve a small section of the old factory. They raised money, nickel by dime, to buy a piece of the original hangar. Today it is being transformed into the Yankee Air Museum. It stands as a quiet, humble monument to an epic achievement. It's a place where you can still feel the ghosts of the past. You can stand in the vast empty space and imagine the roar of the machinery, the sparks of the welding torches, the determined faces of the women on the line. You can almost hear the rumble of 1,000 Pratt & Whitney engines coming to life on the tarmac outside. It is a place of memory, a place to honor the ordinary people who did an extraordinary thing. It is a reminder that the greatest monuments to victory are not always triumphal arches or grand statues. Sometimes they are just the quiet, echoing spaces where the hard work was done. So what is the lesson we take from the story of Willow Run? What is the moral that echoes down to us today from that long-ago struggle? It is a story about the danger of arrogance, the fatal blindness that comes from believing in your own superiority. The German generals laughed because they could not imagine a world that did not operate according to their own rules. They saw difference and called it weakness. They saw practicality and called it primitive. Their defeat was born in that laughter. It is a story about the quiet, devastating power of being underestimated. It is a reminder that true strength often does not announce itself with a roar. It builds in silence. It is found in the steady, patient, unglamorous work of those who are overlooked and dismissed. It is the power of the underdog who refuses to quit. And most of all, it is a story about the difference between a collection of brilliant individuals and a truly united system. Germany had brilliant scientists, brilliant engineers, and brilliant generals. But they were a collection of warring fiefdoms, crippled by ego and internal competition. America, in that moment, became a system. It was a messy, inefficient, and often frustrating system. But it was a system that learned, that adapted, and that pulled, however clumsily, in the same direction. From the president in the White House to the riveter on the factory floor, from the general in his command tent to the grease monkey in a muddy field, They were all, for a brief, shining moment, part of the same machine. This is the timeless truth of Willow Run. It speaks in our societies. It warns us against the kind of pride that leads to blindness. It encourages us to find strength in collaboration, in humility, and in the relentless pursuit of a common goal. It reminds us that the most powerful force in the world is not the genius of a single individual, but the united will of ordinary people who have decided that they will not be defeated. In the end, it all comes back to that room of polished marble and the laughter that once filled it. They laughed at a nation of shopkeepers, until they learned that a shopkeeper knows how to manage inventory, and that war in the end is a matter of inventory. They laughed at a nation of car makers, until they realized that the men who had put a car in every garage could also put a tank on every battlefield and a bomber over every city. They laughed at the idea of a single factory, a single, absurdly ambitious factory. They laughed, and they planned, and they basked in the glow of their own perceived brilliance. They never heard the sound from across the ocean, the sound of hammers, the sound of rivets, the sound of a million hands working as one, a sound that grew from a whisper to a hum to a roar to an all-consuming thunder, a thunder that would cross an ocean, darken their skies, and shake the very foundations of their empire, a thunder that was the final answer to their laughter, a thunder that would, in the end, be followed by a profound and everlasting silence.